I don't really feel like I can do any kind of conversation around immigration in Canada without doing a special thing about the Chinese Exclusion Act and head taxes, because in a lot of ways they illustrate just how far the Canadian government was willing to go to maintain sort of their preferences for particular types of immigrants and how those preferences wound up getting played out. So if you remember from our last video, for a really long time, immigrants from Asia were very low down on the priority list, but that doesn't mean they didn't arrive. And in particular, this is sort of a geographic question. Most immigrants from China, from Japan, from all parts of Asia arrived in Vancouver and not in Montreal. And that's a very simple geographic question in that if you are arriving by boat, it's way faster to get to Vancouver than it is to get to Montreal. And that sort of means that, again, those sorts of ideas about which groups of immigrants were concentrated in which places, immigrants from Asia are disproportionately initially sort of concentrated on the West Coast. And there are some consequences of that. So one of the things that sort of happens is that there's a particular brand of anti-Asian racism happening that occurs in British Columbia, specifically around Vancouver. And there are lots of flavors of this. We'll sort of talk about the head tax, but the same kind of anti-Asian racism comes up when we start talking about the internment of the Japanese during the Second World War. And there's some conversations about, for example, British Columbia's foreign ownership tax being disproportionately targeted at managing or minimizing the percentage of Chinese immigrants in Vancouver as well, by sort of discouraging them from living there. So essentially, the idea of the Chinese head tax was designed, okay, so step back. Canada imported and encouraged the immigration of a large number of Chinese laborers to build the railroads through the Rockies, though that labor is really, really important in getting that work done, partially because the understanding was that a certain amount of that work was going to be very, very dangerous. If you're thinking about the trains and the tunnels through the Rockies, really the only way to do that is to basically sit there and explode parts of mountains to dig tunnels through them. Not an easy thing to do, and very dangerous work, because if you screw it up, then the mountain comes down on your head. So a lot of this work was really dangerous. A lot of sort of white laborers didn't want to do it, but there was a perception that the Chinese population would be desperate enough to do that work. And so the expectation was, the goal was, to have these Chinese laborers come to Canada, build the railroad, and then go home to China. And one of the reasons that sort of is really, really important is that the Chinese head taxes were intentionally designed with the idea of discouraging Chinese immigrants from bringing their families to join them from China. So you can get a certain type of visa to come over as sort of a laborer for the CNR, but you can't. But that's not necessarily the same for bringing your family over. You need a different visa for that, and there's a sort of an expensive piece about that. Okay. So these taxes are in place from 1885 until 1923. Sort of talk about that progression. And in that time period, if you were immigrating to Canada from China, you were expected to pay a fee. In 1885, it is a $50 fee. And it rises very, very quickly, so that before, I think, 1910, actually, that fee is about $500. And I'm just going to put this in a little bit of context for people, because I know I have many students who have done the sort of immigration journey to Canada, and the idea of $500 doesn't sound that crazy, because you need to get medical exams, you need to get documents translated, you need to sort of pay the application fees. And $500 doesn't sound that crazy, and to many people, sort of the idea of paying $500 to move to a new country also sounds manageable. I'm going to put it in context for you. We're going to talk a little bit about homesteading, and there's a great video about Amber Valley that I didn't make, but you guys get to watch it in this sort of series. And at the time, So while Canada, the Canadian government is charging Chinese immigrants at least $50 and more likely $500 to immigrate to Canada, it is possible to buy a homestead for 10, and the average price of a house is about $250. And if you sort of use that metric, then you're talking about a fee to immigrate to Canada that is more like $700,000, because the average price of a home in Canada is now around $350,000. Or this is the less expensive one because of the way that wage growth has gone. $500 is about 2 years' wages. And that you sort of work at sort of median income levels in Canada. That means that we're charging at least around $100,000 to immigrate. This is intended to be a financial hardship. It is supposed to be really, really difficult to pay. And the reason for that is because if it's really like if it's a quarter, you have to pay 25 cents to immigrate, then that's not really a deterrent. When you establish it as a financial hardship, the intention is to make it a financial hardship. The intention is to basically encourage people to go back to China rather than to sort of settle in Canada. This is actually consistent with policies in places like the United Kingdom and in the United States at the same time. This is not a unique to Canada kind of issue. I'm just talking about the Canadian context because this is a class in Canadian history and society. This sort of idea about head taxes is connected to sort of other requirements. So there are requirements to sort of register your presence and sort of tell people where you're going to be. There's more stringent documentation requirements. There was sort of a perception that people immigrating from Asia would be more likely to carry disease, so there were sort of additional fees for medical exams and that kind of thing, which is really, really important. There's also a lot of stuff in here that's not necessarily about China and more about how the British at the time viewed acceptable ideas of male sexuality and of female sexuality, actually. So if you think about what sort of the way that Chinese people were invited to Canada, they were invited to do very dangerous manual labor building railways, specifically through the Rocky Mountains. That is, generally speaking, work that is going to appeal, especially in the 1800s and the early 1900s, that is going to go disproportionately to men, because sort of social norms do not permit women to sort of engage in that kind of thing. And that sort of means that, again, do you remember we sort of talked about this when we talked about early immigration into New France? That creates a really interesting gender dynamic in that there are way more Chinese men living in Western Canada, sort of from in this period of time, from the 1880s through the 1920s, than there are Chinese women. And there was a perception at the time that Chinese men were likely to prey on, putting that in quotes because it's not true, this is the perception of the time, were likely to prey on white women and sort of take advantage of them sexually because Chinese men were perceived to be more effeminate and therefore less threatening. And I say that this is connected to sort of Victorian ideas of what's going on because this is really about an understanding of male sexualities that is fundamentally predatory, and an understanding of female sexuality that women don't have sexual agency, that they just get taken advantage of. So there's some other things going on in that, but the perception was that Chinese men would take advantage of white women. This plays out if you've ever sort of looked at Emily Murphy. If you know Emily Murphy's story, she also wrote a book called The Black Candle, which is all about the dangers of opium dens and the yellow peril and the sort of dangers posed to respectable society by immigrants from China. And that was very common in terms of sentiment at the time. But I will say that that sentiment is actually quite localized in that partially because of where this sort of thing happens, where the immigrants from China settle. Um, this is a major concern in British Columbia, and the federal government, and so like the Chinese head tax exists not because the federal government said, you know what we should do? We should discourage immigration from China. It exists because members of the sort of federal government from British Columbia said, this is a massive issue and we need to make it a national policy. And the rest of the country kind of went, I guess. We don't really care, but sure, we'll do that for you. No problem. And again, same thing is largely true about the internment of the Japanese in the Second World War. If you're sort of familiar with that, it's very much the similar pattern in that there's a pattern to push for that kind of regulation and restriction on the part of the governments of British Columbia. So there's that kind of conversation. And it was supposed to do this, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The idea was to sort of discourage people from doing that, and the reality is that you just had people who decided that it was worth living in indentured labor for years and years and years of their lives to be able to offer their families better lives in Canada. They just borrowed the money. You had similar situations to sort of what happens coming north, coming from sort of South America into the United States. There are families that were quite willing to sort of borrow an incredible amount of money or whole villages to send someone to sort of collect to send someone over in order to sort of offer better economic opportunities. People just borrowed the money and just paid the tax. It didn't work, and that's why I say that it ends in 1923. It does. The Chinese head tax is ended in 1923, but it's not because Canada realized that, hey, it's really dumb to be charging people $700,000 to immigrate to this country where they have to still build their own homesteads and their own houses. It's because in 1923, you wound up with the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is a law that genuinely just said, no, we don't accept any immigrants from China. And those immigration restrictions aren't actually eased until 1947, which sounds like a weird date, until you recognize that part of this is really connected to the idea of othering. And 1947 is when the restrictions on immigration from Japan are also eased. So there's a conversation there. It's just after the end of the Second World War. And it is, again, sort of based on a really strong sort of sense of othering in that the population of Japan and the population of China were basically treated as a single unit in sort of a lot of policy documents, even though they have vastly different cultures and vastly different sort of political orientations. And especially when we talk about the Second World War, we're only at war with one of them, but there's limitations on both. Again, a lot of conversation about othering, which is a really interesting kind of conversation to get into here. I do sort of want to point out that this is not totally crazy, and that we have sort of kind of dealt with this, kind of a little bit. Redress for Chinese head tax payments became an election issue in 2006, and there were symbolic redress payments of worth about $20,000, which again, if you go back to sort of the real world terms about what that amount of money is worth, $20,000 really is symbolic of this whole thing, but they were made in 2009. But there were a lot of families who were still excluded and were not able to claim those payments, because in order to be able to claim those payments, you had to still have the paper documents that proved that your family had paid the tax. The government has a list of those, but that wasn't enough. You had to still have essentially the receipt. And if you think about it, this is 2009, the tax was last paid in 1923, so you have to keep that receipt for 80 years for some reason in order to be able to get that. So there were a lot of families that were excluded from that payment, but there were redress payments made in 2009. But you can't really talk about understanding immigration in Canada until you understand the depths of how far people are going to sort of attempt to keep Canada looking and feeling like they think it's supposed to. And in a lot of ways, that conversation about what Canada is supposed to look like and feel like is predominantly white, predominantly British, predominantly Protestant. And it hasn't been it isn't very old that we start talking about Canada in different ways.